Chapter 10, Learning Objective 2, will get into quite a few studies that were performed, what we'd call a historical perspective on motivation. One of the first big scientific studies was done by a gentleman named Frederick Taylor. This was looking at employees as he did back then, and most managers, they believed that employees worked only for money. Also that they had to be very closely supervised. This came up with a plan at that time, about 100 years ago. They came up with what's called a piece rate system. They knew that people were producing things at different levels, so they began to pay on how many of a certain item you produced per day, for instance. The second set of historical studies was done by the Hawthorne guys. They attempted to figure out how does the work environment affect productivities. They had a surprise in this study. They went into different parts of a factory, turned lights up, turned lights down. They expected in one case or the other they would have decreased productivity, but lo and behold, in both cases they had increased productivity. We'll talk more about how that worked later. One of the following studies was done by a gentleman named Maslow. He developed what's called a hierarchy of needs, which looks like a triangle pyramid, and it's got 5 sets of needs, starting at the bottom with physiological, safety, third is social, then esteem, and finally self-actualization at the top of the pyramid. Obviously, people are motivated first by what they'd call the physiological needs. That would mean you need housing, you need food, you need clothing. And what he says in his study, as you complete one set of needs, get that taken care of, you move up to the next need, which is safety, and then to the next, which is social, and so on. However, he admits during this movement, you may be in more than one level at a certain time. You may not be quite finished with one of the needs, and you're working on the next level. The next study was Frederick Hertzberg. He found that job satisfaction and job dissatisfaction are influenced by different factors, not the same. Motivation factors are things like recognition, responsibility, things like that affect the degree of satisfaction. However, the absence of those things does not necessarily cause dissatisfaction. And then Hertzberg talks about hygiene factors, which are pay and working conditions. These things affect an employee's degree of dissatisfaction, but again, do not affect satisfaction. Then we get into some things called theory X, Y, and Z. These are concepts of motivation. Number one, X is like the Hawthorne studies and Taylor's, where they assume employees dislike work. They'll only control well in a highly controlled situation. Then you have theory Y that came along, and just the opposite of the first thing. That suggests that employees can be motivated to behave as responsible members of the organization. Finally, theory Z came up many years later, actually, emphasizing long-term employment, collective decision-making, and individual responsibility for the outcome of decisions. Talks about informal control and even a holistic concern for employees. Reinforcement theory is based on the idea that people will repeat behavior that is rewarded and will obviously avoid behavior that is punished.